Hello, I'm Rob Dickinson. I'm with Community Rights Lane County, and I'm glad to have you all here for a panel discussion on the people versus Agent Orange. We've got a great panel here of people in Oregon who have direct experience with the aerial spraying of herbicides in our communities, affecting our families. As this was an incredibly powerful film documenting war crimes that started in the 60s and crimes against humanity that go to this very day. And aerial spraying is still a threat to our families. And we have a great group of folks here who have been for many decades in the front lines of the fight against aerial spraying. So let me introduce our great panel. We're going to actually introduce each other, starting with Renee Stringham.
Hi, I'm Renee Stringham. I was a family physician in Oregon, in Lincoln City, and actually in Newport too for a while. And I got involved in the herbicides fairly early on in the 70s.
Thanks, Renee. Roy, why don't you go next?
My name is Roy Keene. I've practiced forestry in Oregon for 50 years and was first involved with spray in the early 1970s when the Forest Service was using Agent Orange.
Thanks, Roy. And we're going to all get our chance to talk about those stories in a little bit. Michelle, why don't you go next?
I'm Michelle Holman. I live in the Coast Range, Deadwood, Oregon. I'm a member of Community Rights Lane County.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And Kat? Kat, we can't hear you.
I am a long-term 65-year resident of Douglas County. I come from a millworking family.
Thanks, Kat. And Rio, why don't you go next and followed by Barbara?
Yeah, my name's Rio Davidson. I live out in Newport, Oregon, member of Lincoln County Community Rights, and we push forward an initiative to ban aerial pesticide spraying in our county.
Thanks, Rio. Go ahead, Barbara.
Hi, I'm Barbara Davis. I live in Waldport, Oregon, central coast of Oregon, and I was involved in the aerial spray ban here in Lincoln County, and I'm a member of Lincoln County Community Rights.
Thank you. And we're going to go around and let each of our panelists have a moment to talk about their experiences with aerial pesticide spraying. And we're going to start with Renee, who has many decades of experience with this practice.
Well, in 1975, my husband and I moved from an HEW clinic to Oregon at the coast, where we decided we would make our home. And I was busy setting up a practice, having children, and my partner, Terry Gutzel, had a number of patients who were sprayed. He left our practice and left those patients to me in my care. And I realized I didn't know anything about it. And so I started researching it, which has always been a passion of mine. And Dr. Ruth Shearer, who published a wonderful research paper for the University of Washington on toxicity of TCDD and also Agent Orange, was wonderful to help me with that. And so I continued researching this and taking care of patients. Another patient of mine, Norma, had a farm out east of us, and she ran out into her garden because they were aerial spraying her garden. She ran out and was caught in the spray, fell down, and the helicopter turned around, came back and resprayed her. So she was drenched with the herbicides that were being sprayed. And people found her, brought her into the hospital. She was in the intensive care unit for 3 days. And so this became a very personal issue for me because these were my patients who were being affected. And I realized this was not something I could just walk away from and say, oh, I'm just a doctor. So as I started getting more research-oriented papers and the ability to speak a little bit better, I started educating the other doctors in our area, as well as community groups about this. And one of the biggest things that happened is that we had a wonderful conference with our medical society, in which the medical society, and this was, I think, in 77 or maybe 78, agreed to sponsor an initiative petition to ban not just aerial spraying, but spraying within a buffer zone of any stream that was then used for drinking water downstream, because we felt that it was really important that people have clean water in their community to drink. And I also started doing education up and down the coast for other medical societies. And this brought me into the public light, both me and my husband into the public light. There was an article around what was happening in Lincoln County in Sports Illustrated. I just looked back at an article from 77 in the LA Times. It was almost a page long in the LA Times. And my friend in New York called and said, "Did you know you made the bottom corner of the front page of the New York Times?" Well, about this time, the forest industry and the chemical industry were getting really upset. And Carol had just lost her children in the fire, which is shown in the documentary. And on a Saturday morning, I had two men in suits come to my door at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. My husband and I were in practice together, so he was at the hospital making rounds, and I was home with my two small children. And they asked if they could come in, and I made the incorrect assumption that they were reporters, because there were reporters showing up all the time. And they sat and talked for a while. I made us coffee, and we talked about herbicides and why it was so important to me that the herbicides stop being sprayed over places where people were going to either ingest them or inhale them. And then one of them asked me, "Have you ever seen the movie Silkwood?" And I realized that these were not reporters. And I said, "Yes, I've seen Silkwood. I think maybe it's time that you folks left." And one of them said, "Do you always know where your children are? You know, it looks like they run around pretty freely." And they did. I had a large fenced yard, and they ran around pretty freely in the yard. They were, I think, 5 and, well, no, actually they were younger than that, 4 and 2, somewhere around there. And they were free in our neighborhood. They didn't go off the property much, but they did go with other people. We did go to the beach. We were across the street from the beach. And I said, "Of course, I don't always know where my children are." I said, "I usually know where they are." I said, "Or my husband knows where they are." And they said, "Well, we just wanted to know if you always knew where your children were." And I said, I think it's time you folks left, because I realized this was a threat against my children. And I was willing to take a threat against me, but I was not willing to take a threat against my children. So I quit at that point. I bundled everything up, and I took all the papers, which was 5 file drawers full of research papers, down to Eugene, to the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm out of this at this point. And I was an expert witness for the EPA on the 2,4-D cancellation hearings. And other than that, I just got out of it because I was frightened for my children's lives.
Oh, that's a terrible story. I mean, the fact that they were intimidating you, and the film also spoke to people being followed, another form of intimidation too. And it speaks to the fear the industry had of the activism, that the activism was really threatening their practice of spraying.
Yeah, once it became a national issue, it seemed to be, when we were in Lincoln County and, pretty much focused there, they were against us, but they weren't quite so frightened. But when it started showing up on the East Coast and in the LA Times and in Sports Illustrated, it was threatening to be a real national issue. So,
right. And these days we still find that, there are people in, cities that are surprised when we talk to them about the fact that this still goes on, that people, their immediate reaction is, what a horrendous practice, how can that possibly be? And they're surprised when we tell them that it still happens. Why don't we shift to you, Roy? You were also, Renee comes at this from the medical perspective and the health side for the families she was treating, and you come at it more from a forestry perspective. Why don't you give us a little bit about what it was like when you were practicing forestry in the 70s and how you got exposed to this?
In the early 70s, the Forest Service was spraying big chunks of the Siskiyou National Forest that they thought were, quote, infected with tan oak, because the Forest Service wanted to grow timber. They didn't want to grow tan oak, even though it has wide benefits to wildlife. So they were suppressing tan oak, and we saw large chunks of land, half sections, 300, 400, 500 acre chunks of land that they had sprayed. And in some cases, the spray was so toxic that they had killed not only the tan oak, they had killed all the conifer, killed all the Doug fir, killed who knows what else. They had just basically sterilized these sites. And not pleasant. My neighbors started noticing that deer had distorted innards, their livers were distorted. I lived in a backcountry part of the world in Southern Oregon, and people ate venison. Venison was a mainstay. And so, like all hunters, they knew the condition of the herd and the condition of the deer. And we began to realize that a lot of these scenarios were connected. And at some point in time, we began to organize. It was very rural. We didn't have anyone with any skills, organizationally speaking. And we began to speak out against it. And then finally, we met people like Norma and others that had organized and contributed our story. But then over the last 50 years practicing forestry, I've worked with thousands and thousands of acres of successfully grown timber that's never had any herbicides on it, whether it be by hand or whether it be by helicopter. Of course, when you spray with a helicopter, you put a great deal more per acre on the land because it's broadcast, it's a saturation. When you spray with a hand pumper, you're much more discreet. And when you combine the size of Oregon's clear cuts with the amount of helicopter spraying, over time, this becomes a major problem in terms of long-term productivity and in terms of endangering downstream water supplies, because you've just got a lot of it out there and it's continual. It's not just sprayed once. Some of these plantations are sprayed 3, 4, 5, 6 times. So it puzzled me why the industry was so committed to spraying when it was made perfectly evident, even by large industrial forest owners like Collins Almanor Pine managing 100,000 acres, that you didn't need to spray poisons on the forest to grow trees. I mean, come on, folks. Trees have been growing for thousands and thousands of years without spraying poison on them. And the interesting thing is that the industry makes the claim, which is debatable among forestry circles, that spraying accelerates the growth. Yes and no. It may accelerate the initial growth by removing vegetation, which would compete with seedlings. But then you have to ask yourself, over 30 or 40 or 50 years of spraying on this ground, what have you lost in long-term productivity? What have you lost in mycorrhizal regimes? What have you lost in soil nutrients? What have you lost in terms of the forest supporting itself in a natural realm like it always has? So it's very obvious to me, having practiced forestry all these years and having worked with literally hundreds of owners of different sizes and scales, of which very few of the ownerships that I work with are big into spraying. A lot of them have done a little bit of spraying, hand packs, backpacks. Most of them have done no spraying. And there's ownerships I work with right now in Lane County that have managed more than several thousand acres over time without spray, without herbicide, and have been on the land for 3 or 4 generations and growing several rotations of timber over time without herbicides. So, you know, the reality of it is it's a way for these chemical companies, when they stopped poisoning Vietnam, to move on shore and poison us. I mean, that's the way I look at it. I just figure, well, you can't poison Vietnam anymore, so you're over here poisoning Oregon. And that's what they're doing. They're poisoning our state.
Thanks, Roy. Michelle, let's go to you. And you've been in the Coast Range for 40 plus years. Why don't you talk about how you've gotten exposed to this?
I grew up in Southern Oregon. I moved to Deadwood in the 70s, right out of the University of Oregon. Thought I'd move to paradise. It's glorious here. We were part of those back to the landers in the 70s. Found out about aerial herbicide spraying really through Carol Van Strum and the Five Rivers community. Their work raised the awareness of chemical spraying and eventually stopped clear cutting and the spraying in the federal forest. But of course, the clear cutting and the application of these toxic chemicals is still legal on 35% of private forested lands, which is about, this is from a timber industry website that I was researching, the Associated Oregon Loggers. It's about 11 million acres of 31 million total acres of Oregon forested land. So those lands are still being sprayed with impunity. Agent Orange was outlawed in 71, but it's been replaced by a vast array of other internationally recognized as hazardous chemicals. And so, as you were saying, Rob, a lot of people still don't even know that spraying occurs. I was at a Zoom party the other night explaining our plight, and a woman was just astounded. She's like, "What? They can spray you from a helicopter? They spray chemicals, toxic chemicals?" She said, "That sounds Machiavellian." And I said, "Yeah, it really is." So in Deadwood, we had health impacts starting in the later 70s, actually probably earlier, but I got here in like 77. Brain cancers, stillbirths, miscarriages. I myself, I've got 2 beautiful kids. I experienced 10 miscarriages. So, you know, as a community, we decided we were going to fight, inspired again by the Five Rivers folks. We created an organization called Forest Matters. And we wrote letters and we called and met with government officials, with our elected people, agency officials, corporate heads. We met at the corporate headquarters. Corporate officials came to us in Deadwood and talked to us, trying to allay our fears. We used all the good activist tools. We protested at corporate headquarters, and still the spraying continues. It continued and it continues to this day. And why? As they all told us, because it's legal. It's a legally protected corporate activity. So, you know, the system isn't broken. It's designed to help those big corporations. And I'll talk more about what my trajectory looked like after I got that aha moment.
Thanks, Michelle. Kat, why don't you go next?
As I said, I grew up in a sawmill-oriented family, and I really thought everything was fine until 2015. In 2015, we had a 28-acre old growth park. It was the first park in Douglas County. It's on the Coos Bay Wagon Road. And it has a spring with a stream that runs through it. And one day went out there and they were logging. They were logging our old growth natural park. they clear cut it, and then they wanted to spray it. And we were down at the courthouse complaining and fighting with them. We begged them to let us mulch the park and replant with varied species, but no, that it's now planted with the new bionic mutant trees. Because of my involvement with the group that defended the park, I got involved with Umpqua Watersheds, and Umpqua Watersheds really shed a light on me about how horrible the Forest Practice Act was and is. I have not personally ever been sprayed, but I know people who have, that live out in the Callahan Mountains, which is the east edge of the Coast Range here. And they've been sprayed, and the industry doesn't care. They don't care at all. And I got involved with community rights because we had Ernie Nemi come to talk about how the logging industry was just going to log until there was nothing left. And so that's I came to community rights through Lane County Community Rights, and we now have formed our own community rights group. It took me like 4 years to get us all together and get it done.
Thanks, Kat. And it's great to have the work going on in Douglas County now. So thanks for all that. Kat mentioned the Oregon Forest Practices Act. So let's put a pin in that and make sure that if it doesn't come up in the stories, we come back to what that is and how that affects our work. Rio, why don't you go next and talk? You had some real experiences growing up with spraying.
Yeah, I grew up all over Oregon, but for some time I lived out in the Five Rivers area. And as a young child, you're kind of like, lost on the bigger picture. I think watching the movie and those old news accounts, really brought it into focus on how things were around me, and one of the scenes there where one of the women, faced the cancer. And, I remember that as being kind of the first person that died that I knew. And I didn't realize how young she was until I saw the movie again, and just to see all those lives changed. As a young person, you let things go by, and as I came back to the coast and I saw the same things happening that had been happening for the last 30 plus years, it was really devastating. And my time out in the woods at that point was related more to the sportsman side of things, and doing steelhead fishing and being up on the Siletz Gorge. And that's when I really started witnessing the Forest Practices Act in full force. And, as things progressed, every time I'd go up into the mountains, it would change drastically. And I had to go down to the local water, to talk about why these clear cuts could come up so close to the river. And that's when I started learning about the Oregon Forest Practices Act and these meager setbacks. I think it's 60 feet, sometimes 35 feet from a water source. And, I was looking at this with this land manager, and let's get the Google Zoom, and he started zooming in, and that's probably okay. And what I was looking at was giant mountains that had been sprayed that all came down to the river that our town, 5 towns in our community drink. And I just realized that the impact to the wildlife, to the children, and to our watersheds, things had to change right away. And unfortunately, I just got the very start of it, because in the 3 years after that, they really ramped up logging on the Siletz. And so I witnessed firsthand how things in mechanized forestry can happen so quickly. And as a community member, I just felt like we had to come together. We started having meetings. It was really shocking at how many times at a meeting someone would have direct experience of being sprayed and the health effects. And that really put the fire under us to make some changes. and also to collect those stories, because personal stories, I think when you watch the Agent Orange movie and see these people's stories and realize that that could be any of us that live in the woods and that get our water from surface water, which, you know, the amount of Oregonians that get their water from surface water is huge. So we really have to think about that as communities, especially in the city dwellers who feel like they're safe from all this. But if you look upstream and see where their water comes from, almost all our water comes from these industrial forests. So as a community member, we got together and formed Lincoln County Community Rights. And, you know, we felt like we had to put a stop to what was going on. So my personal experience with that was huge and a big learning experience. And it was interesting that it was only after the fact, after we had won the initiative, that we realized that we were actually battling CropLife America, which is one of the largest PR firms for the corporation slash government slash chemical companies, you know. And when you look at these small groups of communities trying to, you know, do PR battle with the largest PR firms in the world that are built to spin, you realize how everything's so stacked up against local communities making decisions on their own to protect their health, safety, and welfare. And that's where I feel like we as community members have to stand together and put a stop to this, because obviously, you know, we don't have the money or the funding to be these PR behemoths, but we have the truth, we have our community, and we have our family strength, and that's what we need to get through this.
Thanks, Rio. That's really important information. And I'm glad you mentioned the CropLife America and the amount of money spent to defeat you in Lincoln County. I'm just going to call attention to the article in The Intercept by Sharon Lerner, a fantastic, really deep reporting piece on the Lincoln County work and Lane County. And I think if most folks, if they just Google Intercept and Lincoln County aerial spray, they'll get that piece. And it's well worth it, and it's a even more detailed look at some of the great work you've been doing and why you had to do it, and really how the industry just was willing to throw everything at you essentially. So thank you. Barbara, why don't you go next?
Okay, well, I am probably the newest person to Oregon. We moved here in 2004. So I haven't been directly sprayed, but that's only because I ran the house back in Los Angeles. Believe it or not, back in Los Angeles, mid 80s, there was this scare about the Mediterranean fruit fly. Yeah, they were worried about the Central Valley of California because there were a lot of crops there, but somehow they made it a worry in Los Angeles, where you're hard pressed to find a single tree, let alone a forest. So there were times when there would be a whole row of helicopters, and I live just south of South LA, going over the city with pesticides. They would notify you if you were lucky enough to pick up the paper or listen to the radio. They would notify you a day or two in advance to, well, cover your car and make sure your kids are in the house. So I can remember that. I can remember the aerial spraying going on in Los Angeles for a fruit fly that was really not so worrisome in LA. Moved to Oregon in 2004, like I said, and I was very disappointed to find out only 10 years later. I lived here for 10 years before I found out that they aerially sprayed the forest with pesticides, and I was horrified. I'd learned about community rights or read about it a few years before, and so I was really enthusiastic about that idea. It made sense to me. And it wasn't until I met one of the members of Lincoln County Community Rights in late 2014 that I said, whatever it is, I want to be there, because it was community rights. And that wasn't until I joined one of their meetings that I found out about the aerial spraying. Like you said, Rob, a lot of people don't know. I didn't know. And that's when I got involved in the process of writing the initiative.
Thanks, Barbara. And it was the same for me. We moved to a small town in rural Oregon, and we had no idea that that spraying was happening until we learned that it happens to our neighbors just down the road. So, and the same thing is what Rio was saying, when you know, people, when spraying happens right next door, you have no idea what it's going to be like, and you go over there thinking there's going to be a crew of people, and in fact, it's just one guy in a, you know, air conditioned big piece of heavy equipment taking down a huge swath of forest. We've told our stories. I was going to put Michelle on the spot a little bit because I saw the pin she's wearing on her community rights shirt. She has a pin of a close friend of ours, Lynn Bowers. And maybe, Michelle, you could just, you're muted. So if you could unmute yourself and just tell us a little bit about Lynn Bowers, person in the pin, and Audrey Moore as well, who's a fellow activist and friend.
Yeah, I mean, we want to honor the warriors who really were in the trenches doing this heavy lifting. Lynn Bowers was an unstoppable force in the anti-spray campaigns. She lived outside of Eugene in the forest area off of Fox Hollow. She was sprayed a number of times. She was constantly trying to make a bridge between her and her spraying neighbors. Was unsuccessful. And she joined us in the Community Rights Lane County. She was a founding charter mother of Community Rights Lane County. And like I said, just tireless and dedicated, purposeful, passionate, inspiring woman who ended up getting cancer, and she attributes that to being sprayed. She died 2 years ago. And along with her, Rob mentioned Audrey Moore. She lived in the Cave Junction area. She was the Lynn Bowers of her area. And she also got cancer and died. She ended up really being almost a committee of one, because it was such a heavy lift to try to organize and mobilize her community. So I'm sure she would be super disappointed to know that we're still being sprayed, and heartened to know that we're still fighting. So both of them, Audrey and Lynn, you continue to shine a path for us, and we won't stop until they stop.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a heavy heart to just remember all the people who have suffered through this.
Michelle, you just reminded me that beside the miscarriages, we also had a huge number of birth defects. We had children who were born anencephalic, which means that they came out without any hindbrain at all. They looked like a frog. And in my lifetime as a physician, I should never have delivered even one child like that. I delivered my second one, and then I went to a conference here at the University of Oregon Health Science Center at the library, where they talked about the toxicity of these sprays. And that was one of the things. It wasn't just miscarriages. Some of those miscarriages were because the children were deformed. When I called Washington, I discovered that we were a hotspot, along with Benton County, for anencephaly in the United States. So these health defects and the cancers. The Swedish registry kept a registry since the 30s, actually, of people who were spraying or were sprayed by herbicides, and showed tremendous numbers of especially lymphomas, but all kinds of solid cancers. And so that was something that I didn't mention when I was talking about the health defects, but it's really an important issue.
Thanks, Renee. And that was one of the more powerful aspects of the film too, the connection they showed between the huge number of birth defects in Vietnam, and then the effects on the children of people, and as well as the same thing that you're talking about, how that's happening here in Oregon. So maybe let's switch gears a little bit, and we've talked about how we've experienced this, the terrible effects of this practice, but let's talk about how we're going to stop it. Michelle, why don't you start?
Well, thank you, Renee, for sharing that. It just makes me realize that we have to call it for what it is. It is legalized criminal activity. That's what it is. So when you're trying to fight a system that says legalized criminal activity is fine, you're going to find yourself banging your head against the wall. So after the 40 years or so of banging my head against the wall in traditional activism, I really renounced that path. I got onto a community rights sensibility, which says, stop talking to corporations, stop talking to your legislators, stop talking to government officials and agency people, and start talking to your neighbors, because here's where the power lies. We don't have the big bucks. We don't have the big legal arsenal, but we have each other. I mean, there's more of us than there are them. And it might sound a little naive to think like that, but that does fuel our righteous indignation and our ability to continue every day to keep working like this. Community Rights Lane County was born in 2012. And we started with an initiative in 2014 to ban aerial sprays. It's actually what brought most of us into this work. And I really want to thank the filmmakers for creating such an elegant pictorial of what people go through when they are under this kind of assault. The deal is that when we filed our measure, we wanted to have it be an intact community rights measure, which says that you have three parts to it. It's the ban on the harmful activity, it's the enforcement that the citizens have the right to engage in, and the third is the rights of nature. Well, in Lane County, we were not so fortunate to get through that tunnel. We were met with obstacles every step of the way. You know, the initiative system is meant to be the way that the people legislate. Well, that's all well and good until the people start using it. And then those who don't like the fact that you think you might know something, they get all upset and they throw obstacles in your way. So in Oregon, we now have this single subject law. And in Lane County, as opposed to what you folks in Lincoln County got to put forth, we were told, nope, you got to split that thing up. So we ended up having two measures. We couldn't even get to the third one yet. We started with the ban on aerial spray, and then we had the right to self-government, which says we, the people, have the right to enforce this law. It made our work twice as hard because we had to have two separate petitions, 15,000 signatures on this one, 15,000 on this. It took us 2 years. We got it through. And then, of course, we were hit with lawsuits, just constantly being bombarded. The timber companies said we didn't have the right to do it this way. They have a fat wallet, lots of lawyers. We had a brilliant lawyer who had been taking our arguments to the judge, always siding with the timber guys. We just couldn't quite figure that out. But actually, we were not surprised. We expect to be sued. We expect for judges to rule against us in the hopes that there is a judge who has some integrity somewhere on the planet. We know they exist. I think they're few and far between, and they don't seem to be in Lane County. Right now, we're still in court, still waiting for the Court of Appeals to rule on our measures. But the right to local self-government, you know, it limits state and federal government authority, and it prevents us from adding new legal protections. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to add to our protections. We're not trying to take away. We understand that people in their communities should be able to create local laws that enhance our health, safety, and welfare. And, you know, our main goal as community rights activists is to challenge unjust law, what we see as criminal law. Criminal protections for spraying toxic chemicals, or depending on where you live, many other harmful corporate activities. We work to replace these laws with just laws that protect us. And from a community rights perspective, nature's rights must be legally recognized and protected by law. This perception of nature only as property denies nature her inalienable right to exist, persist, and flourish. And so, you know, we think that's crucial. And this system that neglects the rights of nature, it's not going to fix itself. We have to fix it. It's up to us. Yes, we the people, and we're the leaders we've been looking for. You know, we do this work because we love our Mother Earth home. We love each other. this is a values statement. And I do want to point out that along with rights of nature, community rights, it applies to a broad range of rights, including the worker rights, the right to living wage, equal pay for equal work, democratic rights, such as the right to local self-government, which includes our right to write and pass laws that ensure our health, safety, and welfare, environmental rights, the right to clean air, water, and soil. These are what we see as inalienable rights. And it's really important, more than ever, important and relevant that we empower this local dialogue, that we authorize local lawmaking, because we can't count on the corporate governmental alliance. You know, these are some strange bedfellows. And it's just up to us. And if we don't assert community rights, communities are going to continue to wind up as sacrifice zones to corporate greed. We have a moral responsibility to generations that follow us to do this work. You know, I mean, I see it as an honor to be a community rights activist. We strive for social and economic and racial and environmental justice, because there is no justice when our government and our laws embolden corporations to create profits over people and planet. So I'm grateful for this forum, this opportunity to talk. I'm grateful for the film, and I'm super encouraging of folks to join us.
Thank you, Michelle. Really well said and very well explained as well. I think a lot of people don't know exactly the degree to which our communities are hamstrung in terms of being able to do what they feel they need to do, both to protect themselves from harm, like we're talking about in terms of stopping, you know, poisoning from above, or even just doing what's right. So like if, you know, in our community or, you know, our counties or cities, if we wanted to have, say, a $15 minimum wage or whatever we would call a living wage, we can't do that. We're not allowed. That's just prohibited. That's we don't have that right. And it's interesting, if we look at the history, almost the founding principles of the country was this notion of local community self-government, so as far back as the Mayflower Compact, right? So it's really been with us the whole time, but it's been eroded over and over time as corporate power became, you know, much more entrenched and almost hegemonic. Let's
I'd like to just read one little clause that fueled my fires from the beginning. This is out of our Oregon Constitution. It's Article 1, Section 1, and it says, "We declare that all people, when they form a social compact, are equal in right, that all power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their peace, safety, and happiness. And they have at all times a right to alter, reform, or abolish the government in such manner as they may think proper." I went to Oregon schools. I never heard this clause. So I'd say it's a big omission in our education.
Cool. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks for reading that. And I'll just joke with Michelle that her husband Richie wouldn't have to read it; he has it memorized by heart. So, so that's the perfect couple. So let's just happen to throw my headset out. So let's switch gears to Barbara and Rio. Barbara, you want to take over and talk a little bit about the Lincoln County work?
Well, briefly, we filed our measure in July 2015. Long, hard fight. We were outspent. Like Michelle said, the corporate interests. We didn't even learn this until after the election, because too, I'm honored to be called a brush fire. I've been called a lot of things in my life, but never a brush fire, and I appreciate that. Anyway, so we prevailed. We won. To our surprise, we won by 61 votes, by a vote of the people. It was a vote of the people. That measure lasted for 29 months. It was the law, even though it was challenged the very next day by a couple tree farmers backed by the big ag people. But on September 25th, 2019, the circuit court judge overruled our measure based on state preemption of pesticides. And she based it on over pesticide regulation. But remember, we didn't ask for better regulation of pesticides. We said, if these are poisons, they're no good. We don't want them better regulated. We don't want a more timely notification of when you're going to poison me. We want no pesticides at all. So we did go to the appeals court. Our attorney filed a brief back and forth. The briefs have gone back and forth, and the most recent brief was the reply brief, and that's the end of the electronic briefs. But what he argued was that preemption is really illegal, invalid in this case, because it's violating our rights to health and safety. The traditional thinking is that this legal doctrine, preemption, prevails when a local law conflicts with state law. The state law always overrules. But we question this. We said, why should a democratic vote of the people, in the interest of protecting their health and their safety, be overruled by a judicially contrived doctrine simply because it conflicts with state law? Lawyers and judges, they speak as if doctrines such as preemption are immutable, untouchable entities handed down to Moses from God on a mountaintop. But we believe this way of looking at preemption is wrong because it allows a small group of moneyed people backed by millions of dollars to control the legal system. This is what's really going on. This is the reality. Preemption, we felt, need to be questioned. It needs to be more discriminate and more nuanced. So we are waiting for the decision and the oral arguments, which should happen sometime after April. And that's where we stand now.
Thanks, Barbara. We'll keep our fingers crossed and hope that we get a judge that's going to see how important this is for communities. Rio, do you want to add to that?
I think, Barb, you put it perfectly as far as, where we're at. I think what was surprising to most people in the community is that we actually didn't have the right to say no to these injustices and to these, heinous crimes against the people in our community. And I think when we started talking with the community members about what they want, right, it's a whole different way of thinking about your life and your interaction with government and the laws. No one had ever asked anyone in Lincoln County whether they wanted to be sprayed before, right? This was just kind of put on us by this corporate government alliance. And when we talk about that, I think Carol saw it. I think other folks that have been fighting this for, 30 years plus have seen it, trying to go to the governor saying, can't we stop this? And it's always, well, my hands are tied, right? And that the timber industry has too much sway here in Salem. And so we also saw our, neighbors to the south in Curry County, Gold Beach, their activism, and they're trying to get some things changed in Salem, and saw the brick walls that they ran up against. And we realized that this really has to be from the bottom up, that we have to come together as communities around Oregon and put a stop to this. Unfortunately, the system isn't set up for that. Michelle, I think, she put that really clearly. It's how many roadblocks you run into when you're trying to create local laws to protect yourself from corporate harms. But that doesn't mean that we can't win. And I think that Lincoln County is a perfect example of how we not only changed the conversation, but we also changed the bar, because all of a sudden they realize they can't just spend and spend and spend and get what they want, because the communities are waking up, people are waking up, and they're realizing that, when they go out into the woods, or if they go out in their backyard, they want to live in a clean, healthy environment. And how are we going to get through these crises? We have crisis stacked up on crisis now. And more importantly than ever, it's to have our health of our community, of our families, of our children, of our wildlife. And without these local lawmaking authority, we're leaving it up to a legislature that's been bought. And unfortunately, the way the system's set up, it's really hard to make those inroads. And that's why I really feel like, with the help of CELDIF and working with them, create your own local laws to stop these is the only way to start pushing back. Because if you go to Salem and you show up and you give your 5-minute comment, that's where it ends. And we can't just have these kind of half stops. We're right here at the end of, the game. It's like, it's time for us to come together, come up with a new plan, because conventional activism hasn't worked. We look at the last 40 years, and has things gotten better? We really have to make this change now. And that's why I think community rights and working with CELDF in a way to create these local lawmaking is the only way to make change in our communities. As Barb said, we have, faced the obstacles that have been set up, and the system set up to, for us to fail. But when people see what happened and see when the community came together and spoke as one against the corporate interests, people, even in Salem, are starting to recognize that, maybe things aren't quite stacked up the way they thought. Maybe there is a room here to break this hold of the timber industry. And so it's really all about getting local communities to step up. And just like those folks in the movie, in Vietnam, that had to come together around those folks that have had those harsh, a lifetime of pain because of this. And Carol, when she spoke about what she saw and what she went through, that motivated our community to make a change. I hope this movie can motivate you to make a change, because it's us that are going to be making our future, and together we can do it. You're not in it alone. You can work with both Lane County, Lincoln County, folks down in Douglas County. All over Oregon, there's people that are in this movement that are here to help. And I think that's what really the message needs to be, is that we're in it together and we can help each other get through this. And I hope that you can come find us. We all have different websites, Facebook, all those things. But remember that together we can make a change, and we have to stop this. There's only us, and we can do it.
Thanks for really good information. And I think the work that you guys did in Lincoln County, I think it really needs to be taken note of, because really, when your initiative passed in Lincoln County, and you guys, my numbers might be a little off, but I think you spent roughly $20,000 was what you were able to raise and spend, really a ragtag operation, person to person and house to house doing that. And there was probably about 600,000 that was sort of on the books in the Secretary of State's campaign filing stuff, but another 1.3 or so million on crop life and the information that documented in the Intercept article. So really, you might have been outspent maybe 100 to 1. It's just outrageous. And I'm sure they assumed that if they just poured enough money in, they would just beat you that way. And when you guys won, it was such a victory, and really a wake-up call for everyone, for the industry to know that they really feared that this could spread, like the brush fire is going to turn into a big one. And then also for people who are doing the work like us, that to see really how just people doing the work, getting out there, meeting people, could make that difference. And so that's a really hopeful thing. And maybe just a little, we could talk a little bit about how it's organized. You mentioned CELDF, which is an acronym, and a lot of folks probably don't know who that is. And that's the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which is a national nonprofit organization that really helps communities across the country to organize to protect their own health and safety. And there's at least a couple hundred communities that are working this way to try to protect themselves. And some of them who have just been at the ballot box and working with their local elected officials and so on, are really great struggles and a lot of good history there to learn. And then within Oregon, we've got a number of communities, like we here on this call, we have Lane, Lincoln, and Douglas, but there's other communities that are either formed or forming in the Portland metro area and Columbia County and so forth. And we all comprise a Oregon Community Rights Network, where we join together to to share our work and to work together on things like lately with the pandemic, where it's hard to be out there with a clipboard. We've been doing a lot of great educational events to really let people learn about how they don't really have the democracy they hope they have, and also about the work we're doing. Another thing the Oregon Community Rights Network is doing is working on a state amendment legislation that would change that would amend the Oregon Constitution to say that it's not okay to preempt local communities when they're trying to protect themselves. And that's something that we're working on. And if folks get in touch with us, we'll help you plug into that work. So thanks everyone for being here. It's been great to spend time with this fabulous panel. I thank you all for sharing your stories, telling us how it's affected you, calling attention to some of the heroes of this work, and really giving folks a chance to get involved themselves. Anything anyone else wants to say before we wrap?
Big thanks, Rob. You're a great moderator.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you for the filmmakers.
Yes, the wonderful film, and we just need to make sure more people see it, because getting the word out is an important thing. All right, thank you.